Anselm's Monologium on the Being of God. Chapter 21. It exists in no place or time. But if this is true, either it exists in every place and at every time, or else only a part of it so exists, the other part transcending every place and time. But if in part it exists, and in part does not exist, in every place and at every time it has parts, which is false. It does not therefore exist everywhere and always in part. But how does it exist as a whole everywhere and always? For either it is to be understood that it exists as a whole at once in all places or at all times, and by parts in individual places and times, or that it exists as a whole in individual places and times as well. But if it exists by parts in individual places or times, it is not exempt for composition and division of parts, which has been found to be in high degree alien to the supreme nature. Hence, it does not so exist as a whole in all places and at all times that it exists by parts in individual places and times. We are confronted, then, by the former alternative, that is, how the supreme nature can exist as a whole in everything individual place and time. This is doubtless impossible unless it either exists at once or at different times in individual places or times. But since the law of place and the law of time, the investigation of which it has hitherto been possible to prosecute in a single discussion, because they advance on exactly the same lines, here separate one from another and seem to avoid debate as if by fashion in the first direction. Let each be investigated independently in discussion directed on itself alone. First, then, let us see whether the supreme nature can exist as a whole in individual places, either at once in all, or at different times in different places. Then let us make the same inquiry regarding the times at which it can exist. If then it exists as a whole in each individual place, then for each individual place there is an individual whole. For just as place is so distinguished from place that there are individual places, so that which exists as a whole in one place is so distinct from that which exists as a whole at the same time in another place, that there are individual wholes. For of what exists as a whole in any place, there is no part that does not exist in this place, and that of which there is no part that does not exist in a given place is no part of what exists at the same time outside this place. What exists as a whole, then, in any place is no part of what exists at the same time outside the place, but of that of which no part exists outside any given place, no part exists at the same time in another place. How then can what exists as a whole in any place exist simultaneously as a whole in another place, if no part of it can at the time exist in another place? Since then one whole cannot exist as a whole in different places at the same time, it follows that for individual places there are individual wholes, if anything is to exist as a whole in different individual places at once. Hence, if the supreme matter exists as a whole at one time in every individual place, there are as many supreme matter as there can be individual places, which it would be irrational to believe. Therefore, it does not exist as a whole at one time in individual places. If, however, at different times it exists as a whole in individual places, then when it is in one place, there is in the meantime no good and no existence in other places, since without it absolutely nothing exists. But the absurdity of, of this supposition is proved by the existence of places themselves, which are not nothing, but something. Therefore, the supreme matter does not exist as a whole in individual places at different times. But if neither at the same time nor at different times does it exist as a whole in individual places, it is evident that it does not at all exist as a whole in each individual place. We must now examine then whether the supreme matter exists as a whole at individual times, either simultaneously or at distinct times for individual times. But how can anything exist as a whole simultaneously at individual times, if these times are not themselves simultaneous? But if this being exists as a whole separately and at distinct times for individual times, just as a man exists as a whole yesterday, today, and tomorrow, it is properly said that it was and is and will be its age then, which is no other than its eternity, does not exist as a whole simultaneously, but it is distributed in parts according to the parts of time. But its eternity is nothing else than itself. The Supreme Being, then, will be divided into parts according to the divisions of time. For if its age is prolonged through periods of time, it has with this time present, past, and future. But what else is its age than its duration of existence, than its eternity? Since, then, its eternity is nothing else than its essence, as considerations set forth above irrefutably prove. If its eternity has past, present, and future, its essence also has, in consequence, past, present, and future. But what is past is not present or future, and what is present is not past or future, and what is future is not past or present. How then shall that proposition be valid, which was proved with clear and logical cogency above, namely, that the supreme nature is in no wise composite, but is supremely simple, supremely immutable? How shall this be so, if that nature is one being at one time and another at another, and has parts distributed according to times? Or, rather, if these earlier propositions are true, how can this later be possible? By no means. Then is past or future attributable to the creative being, either its age or its eternity? For why has it not a present, if it truly is, but was mean past, and will be future? Therefore, that being never was nor will be. Hence, it does not exist at distinct time, just as it does not exist as a whole simultaneously in different individual times. If then, as our discussion has proved, it neither so exists as a whole in all places or times, that it exists as a whole at one time in all, or by parts in individual places and times, so nor so that it exists as a whole in individual times and places, it is manifest that it does not in any way exist as a whole in every time or place. And since, in like manner, it has been demonstrated that it neither so exists in every time or place, that a part exists in every, and a part transcends every place and time, it is impossible that it exists everywhere and always. For in no way can it be conceived to exist everywhere and always, except either as a whole or in part. But if it does not at all exist everywhere and always, it will exist either finitely in some place or time or in none. But it has already been proved that it cannot exist finitely in any place or time. In no place or time, that is, nowhere and never does it exist, for it cannot exist except in every or in some place or time. But, on the other hand, since it is irrefutably established not only that it exists through itself and without beginning and without end, but that without it nothing anywhere or ever exists, it must exist everywhere and always.